Cedar Hollow was a hidden settlement deep in the Missouri Ozarks. A place where survival demanded trust, but where secrets festered beneath the surface. In 1834, tragedy struck when Prudence Hoffman, a widowed mother, lost all three of her sons in what officials dismissed as unfortunate accidents. Yet whispers in the community suggested something far darker. By the end of that same year, 3 more townspeople would die, and Prudence herself would stand accused of murder. Whether she was a grieving mother pushed past the limits of reason, or a woman carrying out a grim form of justice has remained buried in county records for nearly 200 years. The testimonies left behind describe a woman broken by grief and circumstance, but they also point toward deeper corruption among the respected families who held power in Cedar Hollow. What happened that autumn left scars on the community that never fully healed, raising questions about whether madness and justice can sometimes become indistinguishable. Cedar Hollow was more than just another frontier village. With only 40 families carving out lives among rugged limestone bluffs and thick forests, the community lived and died by cooperation. Its meeting house doubled as both church and school, and the tolling of its bronze bell signaled everything from weddings to emergencies. Gardens and small barns fed families through the bitter winters, and men scraped a living from timber and scattered deposits of iron ore. Prudence had come there with her husband Samuel 7 years earlier, her quiet dignity and education setting her apart from many of the other women. Samuel's death in 1831 left her alone to raise 3 boys. Thomas, the dependable eldest, at 12, Benjamin, the thoughtful 9-year-old, and Isaac, only 6, and still clinging to her skirts. They were her reason to endure her hope in a hard land. Neighbors stepped in to help, led by Josiah Grimby, the settlement's de facto leader, who often sent his sons to work her land. Yet even in this place built on mutual dependence, the boundaries between kindness, control, and something more sinister were thin. What unfolded in 1834 would push every family in Cedar Hollow to question not only the quiet widow on the edge of town, but also the powerful men who claimed to guide their lives. In Cedar Hollow, charity was never free. Josiah Grimby's help around the Hoffman homestead came with the unspoken demand for deference, a reminder that families on the margins survived only by staying in the good graces of those who held power. Meritable Stokes, the settlement's matron in all but name, made sure Prudence never went without preserves, medicines, or a warm loaf of bread in the long winters when sickness lurked in every draft. Yet her generosity always carried questions, probing inquiries about Prudence's private life that made it clear the cost of her kindness was complete transparency. Reverend Silas Corwin, whose sermons could rattle even the most stoic souls, was another steady presence at the Hoffman cabin. His visits were framed as pastoral duty, ensuring Prudence upheld Christian virtue and that her sons received the moral instruction expected of God-fearing families. But neighbors noted how often his conversations strayed from matters of salvation to the practical concerns of land labor and loyalty. Outwardly, Prudence embodied everything a frontier community admired. She was industrious, pious, and fiercely devoted to her boys. Her cabin was spotless, her garden the envy of the hollow, and her skill in tending wounds or bringing new life into the world made her invaluable. Her children, polite and hard-working, were often praised as shining examples of her dedication, proof that a woman alone could raise a family to respectability. Yet behind this polished surface, the settlement seethed with tensions. Cedar Hollow lived on a knife's edge between wilderness and civilization, where disputes over land, marriage, or inheritance could linger like open wounds. With no courts to turn to, grudges simmered and were often settled through whispers, pressure, or shadowed acts of justice. Missouri itself was a territory in turmoil, unsettled by political divisions over slavery and statehood, and even isolated hamlets like Cedar Hollow felt the tremors of neighbors becoming enemies overnight. Prudence's cabin stood on the hollow's eastern edge, its log walls and stone chimney built by Samuel's careful hands before fever claimed his life. Glass windows, rare luxuries on the frontier, let sunlight spill into the main room where the family cooked, worked, and prayed. The boys climbed each night into the loft their father had crafted, while behind the cabin a barn housed 2 cows and a few chickens. Her vegetable garden stretched neatly toward the tree line, every row a testament to her skill in coaxing food from stubborn Ozark soil. A root cellar dug into the hillside held the preserves that would carry them through lean months. From her kitchen window, Prudence could see nearly all of Cedar Hollow, the cabins clustered around the meeting house, the larger farms on the valley floor, the web of paths and wagon tracks tying the scattered homesteads together. For years that view had been her comfort, a steady reminder of community and rhythm. But by 1804, as the winds of misfortune began to sweep her household, that same view no longer offered reassurance. Instead, it became a stage where suspicion, sorrow, and buried grudges were waiting to emerge. The first blow fell in March, just as winter was loosening its grip, and the ridges above Cedar Hollow were showing the faint shimmer of spring. On that morning, Thomas Hoffman rose before dawn to tend the rabbit snares he'd set along the bluff, a duty he had carried with a seriousness beyond his 12 years since his father's death. The frost still coated the ground, every step crunching like shattered glass, and he carried his father's old hunting knife at his side, the weight of responsibility pressing heavier on his young shoulders than the sack he intended to fill with game. By the time Prudence was at her kitchen table, kneading bread dough, the sound of alarm shattered the quiet. The meeting house bell rang out with a desperate urgency, its echoes bouncing through the hollow. Summoning men from their cabins, from her window she saw them running toward the ridge, their movements sharp and purposeful, in the way that meant only one thing: disaster. What they found at the base of Miller's Bluff scarred the settlement's memory for decades. Thomas's small body lay twisted on the rocks, 60 feet below the narrow trail he had walked countless times. His neck was broken, his skull crushed, blood pooling beneath his head, while the first flies of the season gathered. Witnesses later whispered that his wide, unblinking eyes locked on the pale morning sky would return to them in their nightmares. Josiah Grimby was among the first to reach him, declaring it a tragic slip on slick limestone, the sort of misstep that had claimed many a hunter on the ridge. To the grieving community, it was an explanation that seemed plausible, even merciful. But not every truth was shared that day. The trail of Thomas's boots ended abruptly 20 feet from the cliff's edge, as though he had stopped short, startled by something or someone. In the damp earth nearby, impressions remained of heavy hobnailed boots, the kind no Hoffman owned, stamped deep as if left by a man of strength and weight. More haunting still were Thomas's hands. His knuckles were scraped raw, his forearms marked with wounds that spoke of a desperate struggle. And the snares he had set out to check still hung untouched bait, unspoiled, as though he had never reached them. It was no accident, though no one dared say it aloud, not yet. Meritable Stokes reached the Hoffman cabin before the men had even brought Thomas's body down from the ridge, her skirts streaked with mud and her carefully arranged hair undone by wind and haste. She found Prudence standing in the doorway, pale as death, yet with eyes that burned so fiercely that Meritable faltered mid-step. It was more than grief that marked her face. It was knowledge raw and undeniable. "My boy," Prudence whispered, her voice ragged, her gaze fixed on something beyond the hollow's familiar order. "They killed my boy." The words hung in the cold air like a curse, heavier than the toll of the bell that still echoed across the valley. Meritable opened her arms, prepared to enfold the widow in the comfort expected of frontier women in times of loss. But Prudence recoiled sharp and sudden like an animal braced for a fight. In that moment, something broke in her, an unspoken faith in Cedar Hollow's promise of safety and solidarity. What had seemed a haven of trust was revealed for what it truly was, a settlement laced with hidden rot, its roots sinking deep beneath the soil. 3 days later, the community gathered on the rise behind the meeting house, where the cemetery's iron fence enclosed the graves of those who had built their lives at the edge of the wilderness and paid the price in blood and toil. Thomas was laid among them, his headstone just another marker in Cedar Hollow's short but tragic history. Reverend Silas Corwin stood tall before the mourners, his practiced voice weaving scripture and consolation into a tapestry of providence. He praised Thomas's diligence, his devotion to family, his bright future cruelly cut short, and reminded those assembled that the Almighty's will was beyond human reckoning. His words rolled over the crowd like water over stone, but for Prudence they held no comfort. Rage had settled around her heart like armor. She stood at the graveside in her black dress. Benjamin and Isaac clutched close, her face grim, her eyes sweeping the gathered neighbors one by one. Some shifted uneasily under her stare, as though she were peeling back their polite expressions to glimpse the truth beneath. Later, they would recall that unsettling gaze, how it lingered on certain men and women with a sharpness that suggested she was recording every flicker of emotion, every twitch of a hand, every glance too quick to be casual. At the time, they dismissed it as grief, the hollow-eyed searching of a mother, broken by tragedy. But Prudence was already taking note, already building her own case in silence. In the weeks after Thomas's burial, Cedar Hollow seemed to return to its ordinary rhythm. Men plowed and sowed, women churned and tended, children played in the dust. Yet beneath the surface something had shifted. Prudence's grief sharpened her memory, her eyes catching details. Others overlooked her mind, piecing together whispers and glances that now seemed laden with hidden meaning. The settlement was unchanged in its routines. But in truth, Cedar Hollow had entered a season of suspicion, and it was Prudence Hoffman who carried the ledger of debts waiting to be paid. Life in Cedar Hollow appeared to carry on as always. Men breaking ground for spring planting, women tending gardens and kitchens, and children laughing in the dirt paths, playing the same games their parents had once played in faraway places before Missouri became their home. But for Prudence Hoffman, nothing felt ordinary anymore. Thomas's death had unlocked something inside her, sharpening her memory until past conversations and small details returned with a clarity that unsettled her. Everyday exchanges that once seemed harmless now shimmered with menace. She recalled how Josiah Grimby had questioned her only weeks before the tragedy. Ostensibly, he had come to talk about planting and the clearing of new fields. But the conversation quickly veered toward Thomas. How often did the boy check his snares? Did he walk the ridge trail before sunrise or wait for daylight? Which path did he prefer? At the time, she had chalked it up to neighborly interest, perhaps even a man gauging the boy's reliability for future work. But now those questions felt like reconnaissance, a careful mapping of her son's habits, by someone who wanted to know exactly when and where he could be found alone. The same creeping suspicion began to color her memories of Meritable Stokes. The woman's kindness had once been a lifeline, jars of preserves, home remedies, a helping hand when work grew heavy. But Prudence now saw how Meritable's sharp eyes lingered on her boys, how her questions always cut deeper than politeness required. She asked about their health, their growth, their resemblance to their father Samuel. She pressed about family history, prying for details about Samuel's kin, as if compiling a ledger. Even her comments about how difficult it was to raise sons without a father's guidance now seemed like veiled suggestions that the community might claim some authority over her household. Even Reverend Silas Corwin's pastoral visits grew darker under her reevaluations. The man had praised her sons, commending their discipline and intelligence. But his curiosity had often drifted towards Samuel's past. He asked about Samuel's father, the itinerant preacher, who had once traveled Missouri, officiating marriages and keeping records. A man whose papers and knowledge might contain details the founding families preferred to keep hidden. At the time, she had thought it was a minister's attempt to better understand the flock he guided. Now she wondered if he was digging for something else, something dangerous. This change in her mind didn't come suddenly. It was like the slow breaking of dawn light creeping across familiar ground to reveal shapes and features she had never noticed. By late spring, Prudence was watching everything with a new suspicious eye. She tracked the timing of her neighbors' visits, noting how their questions seemed to circle her children, their habits, and their futures. Grimby had shown up the morning after Benjamin nearly died of fever, more interested in the boy's chances of survival than in offering help. Meritable had made special trips to question her about Isaac's schooling under the guise of discussing his progress. One by one, the pieces began to fit into a pattern, and most disturbing of all were the fragments of memory returning from the morning Thomas died and its impressions. Moments that had seemed insignificant at the time, but which now, when viewed through this new lens, suggested that what had happened on that ridge was no accident of wet stone and poor footing. It was something planned, something deliberate, and perhaps something carried out with the help, or at least the silence, of those she had once called neighbors. In the days after Thomas died, grief blurred Prudence's memory at first. But as the shock eased, small details washed back with cruel clarity. She began to remember muffled voices outside her cabin before dawn, the sound of heavy, measured footsteps on the path, and most hauntingly, Thomas calling out close to the house as if frightened or pleading a sound she had once dismissed as a dream but could no longer ignore. Over the next weeks, she turned mourning into method, watching her hollow from the kitchen window, and on purposefully timed walks, learning to pick out neighbors by the way they held their shoulders or the tools they carried, and tracing patterns that looked less like chance and more like planning. Josiah Grimby kept appearing near the ridge, and close to her place. At times he could only know if someone was tracking her comings and goings, and when she changed her routine, he adjusted his, which told her everything she needed to know. Meritable Stokes, whose jams and remedies had once been lifelines, kept asking oddly specific questions about where the boys played and who watched them, then showed up in those exact spots as if testing the answers she gave. Reverend Corwin came under the guise of comfort and scripture, but his talk always circled back to family histories, bloodlines, and records, the sort of prying that felt less pastoral and more like fishing for secrets. Piece by piece, Prudence fit these moments together. What had felt like neighborly care now read as surveillance and preparation, and the image of her family as protected and private began to give way to the cold truth that someone in Cedar Hollow had been making careful, knowing plans that involved her children. Reverend Corwin's visits became the most troubling of all, cloaked in the authority of faith, but edged with questions that cut too deep. He wanted to know whether Prudence had made plans for her sons in the event of her death, whether she had ever confided family matters beyond Cedar Hollow, and most pointedly, whether Samuel's father, the itinerant preacher, had left behind records that might contain dangerous truths. Each inquiry felt less like pastoral concern and more like an interrogation, as if he were searching for proof that the Hoffman line carried knowledge best left buried. The more Prudence observed, the clearer the picture became. Her family wasn't simply unlucky or cursed. They were being studied, tested, and cornered with deliberate intent. Thomas's death had not been the end, but the first move in a campaign designed to break her family piece by piece. The realization hardened her grief into a cold, relentless fury, and with it came determination. If she was going to protect Benjamin and Isaac, she needed more than suspicion. She needed to know why. Her search for answers began quietly through conversations with the settlement's oldest residents, the ones who had been in Cedar Hollow since the first cabins were raised. She asked careful, seemingly innocent questions about the town's early years, weaving her curiosity into discussions of planting old marriages or the hardships of the first winters. What emerged was a story Cedar Hollow's leaders had tried to smother beneath decades of respectability. The settlement had been founded in the early 1820s by three families, the Grimbys, the Stokeses, and the Corwins. They claimed the best farmland built influence over disputes and assumed leadership without question. Other settlers, including the Hoffmans, were tolerated so long as they knew their place and did not challenge the hierarchy. But under that thin surface of order lay a tangle of rivalries and scandals carried west from Kentucky. Whispers told of marriages conducted in haste or without proper sanction. Children whose parentage might not withstand scrutiny, and land deals struck under questionable circumstances. Some settlers had come west to escape creditors or the law, others to erase stains on their names that would not fade back east. Missouri, wild and unformed, had offered them a chance to reinvent themselves. But their pasts had not vanished. They had only been buried deep beneath the soil of Cedar Hollow, waiting for anyone reckless or desperate enough to start digging. Secrets never truly stayed buried, especially when they were inked into ledgers and bound by law. Samuel's father, the wandering preacher who had passed briefly through Cedar Hollow in its earliest days, had been a man of order and detail. He kept careful notes of marriages, performed births recorded, and family ties acknowledged. At the time, his meticulous record-keeping may have seemed harmless, even admirable. But as Prudence pieced together the fragments of gossip and reluctant recollections, she realized those records had captured things the founding families of Cedar Hollow would have preferred to erase: irregular unions, questionable paternity and property claims that could have undermined their grip on the settlement. The more she uncovered, the more it became clear that the tragedies Cedar Hollow had endured for over a decade were not chance. They were method. Children had drowned in familiar streams, fallen from bluffs they had climbed since infancy, or been stricken by sudden illnesses that claimed them in hours. Sons who might one day question authority, and daughters who might marry into the wrong bloodlines, had been removed before they could grow into threats. What had always looked like misfortune now revealed itself as deliberate culling, a pruning of family lines that might destabilize the false legitimacy the Grimbys, Stokeses, and Corwins had built their authority upon. Prudence's own family was a glaring target. Samuel Hoffman's lineage traced back to the preacher who had officiated at weddings and carried the truth of them in his books. When Samuel died, those records had fallen into Prudence's keeping. She had never studied them, but she didn't need to. Their mere existence was enough to mark her family for elimination. The moment she accepted that came on a stifling July morning. She awoke to find Benjamin's bed empty and Isaac trembling in the root cellar, his small body convulsing with sobs he couldn't explain. The boy whispered of voices outside the cabin, in the night of men whose presence filled him with a fear so deep that he had hidden among jars of pickles and sacks of grain until the first light reached the valley. The hollow erupted in alarm. Every man fit to walk joined the search, spreading through the woods and ravines. Prudence's voice grew hoarse from calling her son's name, her desperation bordering on madness. Yet even in that chaos, she noticed things the way certain men led their search parties, as if they already knew where to look, their paths too precise to be random. 3 hours past sunrise, it was Josiah Grimby's party that found Benjamin. The boy lay at the bottom of an abandoned mine shaft 2 miles from home, a place long hidden by brush and fallen logs. His leg was mangled, His head split open, his small body battered nearly beyond recognition. Yet he lived. When he finally stirred, he could recall nothing of how he got there, only going to bed in the cabin loft, then waking in suffocating darkness, bleeding and broken. Unlike Thomas's death this time, there was evidence that couldn't be brushed aside as mere bad luck. A child spirited from his bed in the dead of night, found in a place only those with knowledge of Cedar Hollow's earliest ventures could have known. It was no longer possible to pretend the Hoffman misfortunes were chance. Someone was hunting her children, and this time they had left fingerprints of intent. Benjamin's torn nightshirt told a story no minister's sermon or neighbor's excuse could erase. The rips were jagged, not from a fall, but from being dragged across hard ground. Blood stained the fabric in patterns that spoke of wounds inflicted before he ever reached the mine shaft. His bare feet were shredded by cuts and abrasions, proof he hadn't walked willingly, but had been hauled or forced through the dark. Rope burns circled his small wrists, silent evidence that he'd been bound. And at the bottom of that shaft lay the most damning artifact of all, a single hobnailed boot, battered, blood-stained, and identical to the prints found near Thomas's body. When the boot was traced to Josiah Grimby, he claimed he'd lost it weeks before while hunting. But half the hollow had seen him wearing both boots just the day before Benjamin vanished. For the first time, even those who had tried to dismiss Thomas's death as bad luck had to admit something was wrong. Yet instead of rising to defend the widow Cedar Hollow's people turned inward, circling their wagons in silence. Their eyes slid away from Prudence, their mouths offered nothing but platitudes. It wasn't ignorance, it was complicity. The settlement itself was a mask, hiding generations of carefully orchestrated murders to erase bloodlines and preserve the founders' dominance. Prudence saw it now with perfect clarity. She was alone, her family marked for erasure, her neighbors bought bullied or bound into silence. If the law could not reach Cedar Hollow, and the church was a pulpit of deception, then justice would come only from her own hand. The realization burned away hesitation. She could no longer be only mother or widow. She would become executioner. Her first target was obvious. Grimby had left his signature on both her sons' suffering and walked the ridge with arrogance, convinced no one would dare challenge him. Prudence spent weeks watching him, noting how he always went to check his cattle just after sunset, taking the same path that cut through oak-shadowed ground well away from prying eyes. On a stifling night in late July, with the air heavy and insects humming loud enough to mask her movements, she took Samuel's old hunting rifle and positioned herself along that path. Dressed in dark clothes, she blended with the trees, heart, steady hands, sure. When Grimby's hulking figure emerged, his boots crunching against the dirt, she stepped out, rifle leveled at his chest. For a moment, silence swallowed them both. "You killed my Thomas," she said, voice low but iron hard. "And you tried to kill Benjamin too." Grimby's face didn't twist in denial or feign shock. Instead, he smiled, slow, cold, and unrepentant. "Thought you were smarter than the rest, didn't you, Prudence? Thought you could piece it all together?" The words hit like confirmation of everything she had feared. In that instant, Prudence's rage felt like holy fire. Yet even as it threatened to consume her, she held to discipline, forcing herself to keep her weapon steady, to press him for more. Because in Grimby's arrogance, she saw a chance not just for revenge, but for answers that might yet save her children. Why, she demanded, the word tearing from her like a wound. "Why, my children? What did they ever do to deserve this?" Grimby answered, as if naming the weather. "Some bloodlines are too dangerous to let live, some secrets too risky to pass on." And when he laid out the quiet campaign of killings that had thinned dissent and secured the founders' power, Prudence felt the rifle in her hands grow heavier with purpose. He told her about Samuel's father's papers, The careful records of marriages and births that would expose illegal unions, disputed paternity, and crooked land deals, and in that moment, Prudence understood the true value of the wooden box beneath her bed. She shoved the rifle up against his chest and held him there while he explained everything, in a voice that sounded like he was listing chores. Then, when his casual cruelty made her blood run hot, she pulled the trigger. The shot cut the night open. Grimby fell with a stain spreading in the dirt, and Prudence worked until her hands shook to make his death look accidental. Dragging his body to the ravine, arranging him as if he had slipped, and burying the bloody hobnailed boot and the rifle deep in the woods. Dawn found her walking back toward the cabin with a kind of satisfaction that erased any remaining illusions of innocence. Killing Grimby was only the first move in a war she intended to finish. When the settlement mourned the next morning, Meritable Stokes came to the Hoffman door bearing preserves and a hollow sympathy, her smile thin and her eyes sharp with something like accusation. She spoke of terrible times and wondered aloud whether misfortunes might be deliberate, and Prudence let her mask of grieving widow slip enough for Stokes to see the steel beneath a warning that she would no longer be a passive target. Accidents have a way of finding people who deserve them. Prudence said her words sharp as flint, hanging in the cabin's dim light like smoke that clung to the lungs. Mehitable Stokes stiffened at the reply, and what followed was less conversation than duel, a careful dance of veiled threats and polished euphemisms. By the time the older woman stepped back into the night, both knew there was no turning back. The war between them had begun, and only one of them would live to see it end. That same night, Prudence began to put her next plan into motion. She knew her enemies would not stop, and hesitation would only mean more graves. Mehitable's pride had always been her root cellar, a stone-lined vault dug into the hillside, and packed with preserves that sustained the community through lean winters. But it also carried a weakness everyone knew about: the old iron latch on its door, worn and temperamental, sometimes sticking, sometimes failing to catch. Neighbors had warned her it was dangerous, but Mehitable, too busy with gossip and control, had never made time to repair it. On a starless night in early August, with clouds burying even the moon, Prudence crept to Stokes's cellar door. Moving with patience born of weeks of observation, she worked the crowbar into the latch's mounting, loosening it just enough to fail under ordinary pressure. It was the kind of sabotage that looked like nothing more than time and neglect catching up to an overworked farm. Satisfied, she slipped back into the darkness unseen. 3 days later, Mehitable descended into her cellar before dawn, lantern in hand, preparing for the church social. The latch gave way. The heavy door swung back. Her scream split the night just as she tumbled down the steep steps. The lantern flew from her grasp, shattering against stone in a spray of fire and glass. Then came the sound, one sharp crack, as her neck broke against the cellar floor, ending her life in an instant. To the community, it was nothing more than a tragic mishap. Everyone had seen her struggle with that latch. Everyone knew her eyes weren't what they had been. They nodded sadly, speaking of the dangers of frontier life, where one misstep could be fatal. And just like that, Prudence had erased one of her deadliest enemies. But Reverend Silas Corwin was another matter entirely. He wasn't just a neighbor. He was the spiritual anchor of Cedar Hollow. A man cloaked in scripture and backed by the wider church. His voice carried weight beyond the settlement, his reputation strong enough to stir officials far outside the Ozarks. To move against him recklessly would be suicide. Yet Prudence knew he was at the center of it all. The secrets, the surveillance, the campaign against her bloodline. And if her war was to end, it would have to end with him. The minister thought he held every advantage, but he had badly misread Prudence. Instead of coming alone to beg for mercy, she arrived at the meeting house after sunset with Benjamin and Isaac beside her. and the wooden box of Samuel's papers tucked under her arm. And when the elders moved to close ranks and the murmurs rose, she opened the box and laid out marriage certificates, baptismal entries, and property transfers that named the Grimbys, the Stokeses, and the Corwins in ink and witness signatures documents that showed births and unions that contradicted the stories the founding families had told for years. And as she read aloud passages that tied particular men to deeds that could be called fraud, and worse, the room changed. Faces went pale, whispers turned to shouts. Some neighbors stepped back as if struck, and others who had been cowed into silence suddenly found their voices, accusing the minister and his allies of running the hollow like a private court. And when Corwin rose to seize the papers and call for order, his authority crumbled because the proof was there in black and white, and because Prudence had already slipped copies to two women who had always hated the founders, and to a traveling peddler who owed her a favor, and who now swore he would take the documents to the county seat at first light. And in that charged chaos, the minister could no longer rely on the community to protect him. His threats sounded hollow, and Prudence stood for the first time not as a hunted widow, but as a woman who had forced the hollow to reckon with the truth it had spent decades bending around. By the time Prudence slid the altar panel open and pulled free the hidden cash, she understood that Corwin had doomed himself by boasting. The compartment was stuffed with the very records he had sworn must never surface Samuel's father's meticulous ledgers of marriages and births deeds, signed under false names. Letters that spelled out collusion and bloodshed disguised as providence. But as she sifted through the brittle pages, her hands shaking in the dim light, she saw the conspiracy was not confined to Cedar Hollow. There were notes in familiar hands that detailed payments to territorial officials, instructions to sympathetic judges, and correspondence with churchmen who had provided theological cover while children were buried and families erased. The scale of it staggered her. Cedar Hollow was not simply a settlement hiding sins. It was a hub in a network of fraud and murder stretching across the Missouri frontier. Her husband's death had been just one link in a chain of killings designed to cement respectability on top of graves. Her sons were never meant to grow into men, because their very blood carried knowledge capable of unraveling everything the Grimby Stokeses and Corwins had built. Standing in that hollowed room, lit only by dying daylight and her own rage, Prudence felt the weight of 2 centuries press on her. She could not defeat them with bullets alone, but she could expose them, scatter their power like ash. With Samuel's knife strapped to her belt rope slung across her shoulder and the documents packed tight beneath her arm, she prepared herself for the final act. If she walked out alive, her children might yet see freedom. If she fell, the truth would burn with her enemies in the meeting house that had served as their sanctuary of lies. The voices in the chamber behind the altar grew louder. Corwin and his allies were gathering secure in their belief that the widow would soon kneel before them with her sons. Prudence straightened her eyes hard as steel and whispered a prayer, not for salvation, but for strength to drag Cedar Hollow's sins into the light, no matter how much blood it cost. The footsteps reached the threshold just as Prudence struck steel to flint and lit the oil she had poured. Flames leapt greedily across the meeting house floor, racing up the dry boards and feeding on the tinder dry beams above. The sudden glow revealed her silhouette at the altar papers clutched to her chest, like Holy Writ, her face set with the calm of a woman who had already accepted her fate. Corwin's voice rang out, over the crackling sharp with command, but edged now with panic. "Mrs. Hoffman, I trust you've brought the boys, as we discussed." Instead of answering, she raised her voice above the roar of fire. "These documents contain the truth about every family in Cedar Hollow, every lie, every theft, every murder. You built your lives on graves, and tonight the world will see you for what you are." The men surged forward, but the fire cut them off, driving them back with waves of heat and choking smoke. Corwin's face, flickering in the blaze, was twisted in rage and terror. The mask of piety stripped away to reveal the predator beneath. "You're burning evidence that could hang half the territory," he shouted. "Those papers protect the innocent as well as the guilty." Prudence stood unmoving, the flames licking higher around her. "Then let God sort them out," she said, her voice steady as stone. "My children were innocent too, and that didn't stop you." When the roof beams began to buckle, she pressed the papers tight against her chest and made her final choice. Escape would only mean capture, humiliation, and the loss of her sons. Staying meant sacrifice, but also victory. The fire would consume the records, but it would also consume the power those records had given her enemies. Without their ledger of secrets, the founders could no longer hold the hollow in silence. The meeting house burned like a beacon through the night flames, visible for miles across the Ozark ridges. By dawn, all that remained was a blackened foundation and charred stone walls, the air thick with the smell of ash and judgment. Corwin and his two allies escaped, but their triumph had turned to ruin. Without the papers, they had nothing to bind their accomplices to silence, and nothing to shield themselves from suspicion. In the days that followed, tongues loosened. Neighbors who had lived under fear began to whisper about accidents that had never felt like accidents, about children buried too soon, about fevers that had always struck the wrong families. Within weeks, word had reached territorial authorities, who rode into Cedar Hollow to investigate claims of fraud and systematic murder stretching back to its founding. Prudence Hoffman never walked out of the fire, but her act tore open the veil the founders had hidden behind for over a decade. The widow who had once stood helpless in her doorway now became a ghost in every whispered testimony, the spark that burned away the Hollow's respectability and left its sins exposed to daylight. The investigation that followed the fire at the meeting house confirmed what Prudence Hoffman had given her life to expose. Territorial officials uncovered a pattern of deaths and disappearances. Stretching back more than a decade, children lost to falls and drownings, women struck down by sudden illness, men crushed in so-called accidents that always seemed to benefit the same few families. The veil of respectability that had cloaked Cedar Hollow tore apart under scrutiny, and what lay beneath was fraud, murder, and corruption on a scale that stunned even hardened investigators. Some of the settlement's most powerful families fled Missouri altogether, abandoning their farms in the night. Rather than face questions about the land they controlled and the blood that had purchased it, others found themselves in courtrooms, the weight of testimony and records leading to sentences of prison or the gallows. What had once seemed like a model frontier community was exposed as a sanctuary for killers who had built their lives on secrets and silence. Benjamin and Isaac Hoffman survived the ordeal, though they carried scars that no doctor could mend. Relatives took them in, raising them with the knowledge that their mother had died not in madness, but in defiance, choosing fire and death, rather than surrendering her children to the men who had murdered their father and brother. They grew to adulthood knowing Prudence Hoffman as both victim and avenger, a woman who had forced the truth into the open at the cost of her own life. Her name became a warning and a legend spoken in hushed tones across the Missouri Territory, a story told around hearths as both caution and inspiration. Some claimed she had gone mad, that grief twisted her mind, and drove her to invent a conspiracy that existed only in her imagination. Others swore she was a martyr who exposed crimes that would have remained buried forever without her sacrifice. The evidence, land deeds, testimony, fragments of Samuel's father's records pulled from the ashes suggests her suspicions were not delusions, but truth too dangerous for Cedar Hollow's leaders to leave unchecked. Today, the story of Prudence Hoffman lingers in the archives, scattered across brittle pages that most historians overlook, waiting for anyone brave enough to piece it together. It reminds us that corruption and conspiracy have never been strangers to America's frontier, and that the line between justice and vengeance often blurs when the law itself is complicit in protecting the guilty. So, what do you think? Was Prudence Hoffman justified in taking the law into her own hands? Or did she become the very kind of killer she was fighting against? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if this tale gripped you, subscribe, hit the bell, and join us next time as we dig into another buried secret from America's shadowed past.